Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty, and we have a very special episode today as we are joined by many of the other wonderful hosts we have here at the GSMC Sports Network. We have Jeremy Lapidus, Sam Menzie, and Garrison McDaniel to help break down some of last night's craziness in both the NBA and the NHL. We are going to be starting off talking about the Knicks, the current status of the team as they are dealing with all types of injuries and the level of contendership that they can still bring despite dealing with all of that. And then in the second segment, we don't do a lot of NHL here on the show, but now that we have a couple experts here, Garrison, of course, hosting the GSMC Hockey Podcast, and Jeremy Lapidus, the Swiss Army knife that he is a master with that as well. But before we get into the show today, just want to remind everyone to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us here at the GSMC Sports Network. For our live viewers, feel free to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on the latest happening in sports. Help make the show as interactive as possible. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net. But fellas, how are we doing today?
Good today.
Doing pretty good. Can't complain.
Doing good.
We are going to be starting off here by talking about that win last night that we saw the New York Knicks taking Game 2 against the Indiana Pacers. Things looked a little bit bleak there at one point where Jalen Brunson left the game with an injury in the first quarter. Circumstances surrounding it were pretty strange. It didn't really look like it was a foot injury, which is what it is being reported as. There was a little bit of confusion there, but he missed the entire second quarter, and then when he came back in the second half, as usual, he was lights out. Now, the Knicks were also dealing with an OG Anunoby injury that took him out in the third quarter through the rest of the game, so we'll be touching on that as well. But I want to start with you, Jeremy. What was your takeaway for the fact that the Knicks were able to fight through these injuries and yet still come away with the win?
Yeah, so you touched on it. Injuries are a major part of the Knicks' season so far. You know, not just this game. They lost Julius Randle near the end of the season, and he's out for the entire playoffs. They've been battling through this, and for the most part, it hasn't affected them because of how Jalen Brunson has been playing. But the fact that they're able to still have this next man up mentality, even with losing all three of their star players at some point in this series or in the previous point in the seasons, they've been able to battle back. They've been dominating the playoffs so far, and Jalen Brunson has been a huge part of that. So having him back out there is going to be big. I'm curious to see how much the lack of OG Anunoby and his defense is going to affect them in the future. But the fact that they've been able to battle through all these injuries has been one of the most impressive parts of this run to me.
Yeah, Anunoby's loss is interesting because obviously Brunson is the headliner, and it seems like for the most part the Knicks will go as far as he can take them offensively, even though you do have to give credit to some of these other role players who, you know, with so much attention on Brunson, he is getting doubled at the end of these games, and we're seeing the likes of Josh Hart, Dante DiVincenzo specifically, come up and hit these big-time shots, but OG's defense also cannot be overlooked in this instance as well. Garrison, do you have any thoughts on sort of the injury bug that is surrounding the Knicks right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of what happens when you play guys 48 minutes a night, as you kind of saw the Knicks kind of doing throughout the regular season. The injuries were always going to catch up to them, and that might affect them going forward in this series. But as long as they keep shooting efficiently, that's kind of what the story of last night was. 57 from the field, 46 from three, 80 from the free throw line. I mean, when they're making their shots, Dante DiVincenzo, Josh Hart, OG Anunoby, when he was in the game, he was lights out. All of these guys very efficient shooting last night, and that's kind of what got them through that game.
Yeah, you mentioned the heavy minutes that Thibodeau has been playing these guys. I mean, it is something, it's a reputation that has surrounded him for whatever
Yeah.
those player polls are worth. There's always those anonymous polls that the Players Association puts out. And Tom Thibodeau is consistently named the number one coach that players would not want to play for. And it's because of these heavy minutes where we've now seen Josh Hart play all 48 minutes of 4 of the Knicks games so far in this postseason. That is the most amount of times in an entire playoff run. We're just in game 2 of the second round, the most since Jimmy Butler in 2013. Who was the head coach for the Chicago Bulls in 2013? It was Tom Thibodeau. So, Sam, I want to ask you about, what do you think the ability for the Knicks to continue playing these players heavy minutes? We know they have a very limited bench unit, and Thibodeau has chosen to sort of stray away from them. Do you think that fatigue could be a factor for the Knicks moving forward?
I definitely think so. I mean, you look at how much the Knicks players have played already. I mean, you said it, Josh Hart has just been overworking himself at this point. I understand that that's kind of his reputation. That's kind of what he's known for, being that kind of gritty little tough player. But playing 48 minutes for 2 or 3 games straight is going to catch up with you at some point. I think we saw it with Brunson yesterday going down with an injury. I think if Brunson does go down with something that is more serious, where he has to even miss a game or two, I think that might be kind of a wake-up call to Tom Thibodeau and the Knicks, just seeing that, oh, our star player is hurt now. So I think it's going to take one of those things for them to stop. But I do think fatigue is eventually going to be a factor. I mean, if you have to play Boston, who is better than you, I'd say, and has a lot more depth than you, I think it's going to catch up at some point. You're going to go into a really tough fight. And let's say you even make it past Boston, you'd have to play a team like maybe Denver, Minnesota, one of the other great teams in the West, Dallas with Luka. So I think at some point fatigue is going to catch up with them, but it's just a matter of time. And I mean, again, this is the reputation Tom Thibodeau has. I think it's going to take something serious for him to kind of open up his eyes and see, but I definitely think it's going to be a factor soon.
Yeah, I feel like for the Knicks, I mean, in general, I don't know if this was the year when they made the trade for OG Anunoby at the deadline, and also the fact we haven't even mentioned the name Bojan Bogdanovic, who was also one of their big midseason acquisitions, and he has also been ruled out for the remainder of the playoffs. It's unfortunate the way that these injuries have unraveled. I feel like this was sort of a year, a stepping year. Now, I know they won a playoff series last year, but I thought that making the move for Anunoby, offloading some of their younger talent, but to become more win ready, I thought that it was going to take a little bit more time to fully develop, but Jalen Brunson has just elevated them to this next level that we're at least having the conversations about them being a contender. To your point about the fatigue, Sam, and how much they are playing, it is sort of interesting to look at the fact where, you know, these guys are going to be worn out not just for this year, but we've seen specifically, if you look back at that Warriors dynasty, there were absolutely instances where coming out of that, we saw Steph Curry and some of those other Warriors sort of be staggered a little bit in the coming regular seasons. Now, definitely, I'm sure if you're a Knicks fan, you're just trying to enjoy the moment right now and make the most of the current situation. But when you have a guy like Josh Hart who is working himself to the brim every single game, curious what that's going to look like long term here. So, is there anybody here who thinks that the Knicks are the biggest threat to the Boston Celtics? Because they are, at least in the Eastern Conference, the measuring stick.
I will go ahead, Jeremy, actually.
Yeah, no, because you talk about the Knicks this season, and really I think a lot of their success in the playoffs so far, aside from Jalen Brunson, has to do with external factors. It's been an extremely weak Eastern Conference outside of the Celtics all season. And I think to say anybody else in the East provides much of a threat to the Celtics is just flat out wrong. The Pacers, they don't have the defense to do it. If you look at the numbers, all the teams that are winning now have a top 10 defensive efficiency rating in the NBA. You know, the Knicks are 9th. They're at the bottom of that list. But the way that they play with the energy, the way that Tom Thibodeau coaches them up, that adds a few extra rankings up there for me. But I don't think they're too big of a threat. We've talked a lot about their injuries, and Thibodeau's squads in the playoffs, especially the younger ones, they tend to do good out of the gates because they're playing with so much energy and so much enthusiasm, but eventually it just catches up to you. And there's a reason he has a losing record in the playoffs over his career.
For me, I don't think that the Cavs are that far off from competing with the Boston Celtics in their series. They were 11 of 42 in that game one. I think that they have a opportunity. You're also in Boston for the first two games, of course. So I think that they have an opportunity to kind of turn the series around when it comes to Cleveland. You saw them win all four games in Cleveland against the Magic. I think that they played different on home court, and that kind of transferred when they went to went to Orlando. They had opportunities in Game 6 after they got that reset kind of in Game 5. Really were close to winning that game. I think that they're able to make it a little bit more of a contending series, and I think that they match up pretty well against the Boston Celtics, especially down low in the paint.
Yeah, I think that offensively, you're right. They did leave a lot of opportunities on the table. I talked about this on my show the other day where the Celtics were very willing on everybody but Donovan Mitchell to give the opposing team's supplementary players a little bit space, heavy drop coverages, trying to take as much as they could away from Donovan Mitchell, and the reality is just nobody else stepped up. Darius Garland had another tough game. We have all seen what he can do, former All-Star. I believe that he should be better in this series moving forward, but it is also, I feel like for me, the biggest issue is I don't know if the Cavaliers are going to be able to play the level of defense necessary to beat the Celtics 4 times in a series, and you're absolutely right. When they come back to Cleveland, they were a great home team during the regular season. During the Magic series, we saw how much that home court advantage mattered. And to your point as well with size, if we see Jarrett Allen back, I do feel like they can use that size mismatch a little bit, especially when the Celtics, I thought that he had a solid game, but bench big Luke Cornett, I know that, as a Celtics fan, I'm probably a little bit more familiar with him than the majority of the national audience is, but Cornett isn't necessarily somebody that you feel super confident in rolling out there for 15, 20 minutes a game. We could see that Porzingis injury end up catching up with them, as we have a comment from our good friend here at the GSMC Sports Network, Kenneth Grunfelder, talking about the possibility of Boston and New York battling out in the NBA Conference Finals as well as the NHL. We are going to be getting into the hockey part of this in the next segment, but just sort of, I guess, as a little bit of a teaser here, out of the 4 teams, for those of you who aren't familiar with the current NHL playoff picture, we also have the Boston Bruins and Florida Panthers, who are both alive in the NHL playoffs as well. So, Garrison, I'll go to you here. Out of those 4 teams, the Knicks, Celtics, Rangers, and Bruins, which one of them do you think is the most likely to break up this super conference finals between Boston and New York?
Yeah, I think it's the Bruins. Clearly, they just dropped the game last night, 6-1 to the Panthers. That's a very deflating game. Of course, they take one on the road, so they have home ice advantage for the rest of this series. But I still do not believe in this team to kind of get past the Florida Panthers, who seemed throughout the regular season, and especially in this game too here, seemed like a step ahead of Boston. It just didn't look good for Boston in game 2 at all. They got that first goal, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the second segment, but Panthers just kind of dominated them.
I feel like for me, I do, and we're going to get into the NHL side of this very shortly, but before we move off of the NBA conversation as things currently stand, I don't know about you guys, I'm not fully, especially dealing with these injuries, I do think that the Pacers have a better shot than a lot of people are giving them credit for. That bench unit and the difference between the Knicks and the Pacers in this situation, I do think is something that can be exploited. We see the full court presses that the Pacers have been running against the Knicks to put the pressure on them, and I feel like again, as we're talking about Thibodeau and the amount of minutes he's putting on his players in this situation, I feel like we could see it end up catching up with some of their key players. And if Brunson isn't at 100%, I don't know if they have those other names they can rely on more. I feel like Deuce McBride is having a pretty solid playoffs. Doesn't seem like Thibodeau is all the way there on him just yet, but we shall see. Does anybody have any other thoughts here on the Pacers' chances against the Knicks in this series? If not, then that is all we have for this segment. We are going to be taking our first break here, and when we come back on the other side, we are going to be diving into the NHL picture of that question that Kenneth just asked us in the comment section. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose your gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Me and the group just talked about the Knicks taking that 2-0 series lead over the Indiana Pacers, but now we are going to be switching gears here a little bit into the NHL, where we have a couple hockey masterminds here in Jeremy and Garrison. Sam, not to discredit you by any means either, but, don't do a ton of hockey here, so I wanted to sort of do a little bit of an overview of last night's games as well as the playoff picture as a whole. And we sort of started to talk about the Bruins dropping that game to the Panthers last night. So I wanted to start there because I do think that this was a pretty rough game for the Bruins, of course, losing 6-1. They actually, in my opinion, looked like they were outplaying the Panthers in that first period. They came out of it with a 1-0 lead. They had some other scoring chances as well, but weren't able to capitalize. And then really from there, it was all Panthers. But we can definitely see the tensions running very high with these two teams. There was the all-out brawl that took place in that third period. There ended up being 136 penalty minutes that were given out in the third period alone. Two teams that definitely don't like each other faced off against one another in the postseason last year. So, Jeremy, I want to start with you. Do you think that the Bruins can still go back to Boston with some confidence, given that they stole game one, or does this seem like a turning point in the series to you?
Yeah, so you can look at it in a couple ways, and this definitely has a kind of turning point feel. When you give up 6 unanswered goals, that's never a good look. But the one silver lining for Boston, and this is something that really no other team in the playoffs has the luxury of, is their goaltending situation. And when you talk about hockey, especially playoff hockey, nothing matters more than a hot goaltender. Jeremy Swayman, who is one of the 2 tandem goalies in Boston, was having an incredible playoff run. He started 6 of the games against the Leafs, and his Game 7 performance is like the reason that they're here in the second round. But behind him, they have Linus Ullmark, who is nothing to scoff at anyway. You give up 6 unanswered goals, you can look at a couple other things, but the Bruins have the luxury of switching goaltenders and still having an elite option there. So going back home, Game 3, I'd expect them to make the switch. They've been pretty adamant about doing that. These two have been switching all the time. You don't see true tandems all the time in hockey, but when you're starting to see this happen, it's not going to lose confidence in the other goaltender, and they have the luxury of being able to do that. So if they can pull out a good performance in Game 3, I don't think it's over yet. That it can be a big change in momentum, though. Giving up 6 unanswered goals is not a good look.
Yeah, they ended up pulling Swayman from the game last night. Now, I don't believe it was fully because his play was so bad, but they seemed like they needed just some sort of other look out there. Swayman, obviously not his sharpest last night. But, Sam, I want to ask you here, because when Ullmark did come in to play for the Bruins, he did allow a goal. Now, again, this was a little bit garbage time. Correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that was the power play goal that the Bruins allowed. They had been phenomenal on the penalty kill for a lot of the postseason so far. But Sam, when you see Ullmark let up that goal in the third period last night, and like Jeremy was talking about with this tandem idea, do you overreact to the fact that he let up the goal last night, or do you feel like give him a clean slate and a fresh ice in Game 3 to potentially steal that one back?
I don't know, maybe it's a hot take or not, but I don't overreact really. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I understand, and I think a lot of people do that, giving up the goal late. But I think, again, give him a clean slate, give him, some time to rest up and just get a new game going. I think last night was kind of just throw it away for the Bruins. I mean, it was a pretty horrible loss. There we go. Sorry about that. That happens sometimes during my show. Can't really control it. But so for the Bruins, I think that getting their goalie tandem really healthy and just kind of focused, I think, is their biggest thing. And I really think that it has been the focus of their teams for a few years now. So I'm not overreacting that much. I think give him a clean slate and he'll be okay. And that's really what I'm watching going forward in the series.
To the question that we answered in the last segment about which of the 4 teams from Boston and New York could break up this conference finals showdown that would really just be an all-time sort of sports rivalry moment there. I know that maybe it's not the, rivalries we're necessarily used to seeing in the postseason in the past decade or so, but I feel like it would still be able to generate that charge anyways, just because of the locations of it and everything. But looking on that other side of the Eastern Conference bracket, we do have the New York Rangers, the President's Trophy winner of the regular season. We know sort of the drama that goes behind that type of an accomplishment. As a Bruins fan myself, I know it all too well after the regular season the Bruins had last year and their eventual fallout. But Garrison, what are your thoughts on the Rangers' possibility of being the first team since the Chicago Blackhawks in 2012-13 to break the curse of the President's Trophy and go on to win the Stanley Cup Finals?
Yeah, I think that they clearly have the best opportunity to do so. This team is amazing. Their top 9, I would say that third line can play as a lot of teams' first lines. It surely would be of any of the bottom 6 teams in the NHL's first line. You get Alexis Lafreniere, Wenberg, and I'm blanking on their right wing, but it's a really, really good just top 9 forwards. And then you're also getting production out of Adam Fox, who played very well in that game too. The Rangers look really good, and I'd be very scared to play them. The Hurricanes, for me, I think, are the team that match up the best against them. The Hurricanes are a very kind of young core, and they, in that first round, got a lot of production out of Seth Jarvis, who's 21 years old, a very young forward. He's amazing. And Sebastian Aho, even more, is amazing. And the Hurricanes still couldn't win that game too, even though Sebastian Aho, I think, played the best game of hockey I've ever seen Sebastian Aho play. So to kind of waste that performance, that kind of spells a little bit of death for the Carolina Hurricanes. And I don't know a team that's beating this New York Rangers team. I don't think anybody on the West has a chance at it either.
Jeremy, do you think going back to Carolina, the Hurricanes can find some way to generate some momentum, or is this the Rangers series here?
Definitely. I mean, when I'm watching these games, about five out of I guess they went to double overtime that one time. So 7 out of the 8 periods that they've played in these first 2 games, I think the Hurricanes have looked like the better team. They're getting more shots on net, they're getting better quality chances, and they're getting more puck possession in the zone. The issue is they're going up against Igor Shesterkin, who is having himself a series. And like I was saying in the Boston series, it doesn't matter how good you are. If your goaltender that you're going up against decides to become a brick wall, you're not gonna win that game. And that's what happened in game 2. I think the Hurricanes were flat out the better team in that game for the entire game. Overtime, double overtime especially, they were getting great chances. So I don't think by any means this is saying they don't have a shot. Going back to Carolina, that's a rocking home stadium if you watched their playoff atmosphere before. So it should be a lot of fun heading back there.
So I know that I don't have much time left with you guys, so I want to quickly look over to the Western Conference. I know that, Garrison, you said you don't know if there necessarily is that same level of contender that could at least knock off the Rangers, who are the odds-on favorites, currently tied with the Colorado Avalanche, according to DraftKings, for Stanley Cup odds. But before we talk about that series, I want to go into the late game from last night where we saw the Canucks beat the Oilers in a 5-4 matchup. This is something that sort of came at least as a surprise to me. The Canucks had a very solid regular season, but I don't know if they were necessarily perceived as this playoff-ready core. And the current, like I said, we knew that we were running out of time there, but that is all. Unfortunate that I couldn't necessarily say the proper goodbye. Thank you very much to the guys for joining us here on the GSMC Sports Podcast today. I'm going to be helping to join some of their shows as well, so definitely keep an eye out for those appearances as well, doing a lot more collaborative stuff here at the GSMC Sports Network. But sort of finishing off the hockey thoughts here, as I was sort of alluding to, the Canucks are the last ranked team in terms of Stanley Cup odds as things currently stand in the NHL. They are plus 1,300, and that's even after taking the game last night. So it is an interesting conversation there. The Oilers obviously have that top-end talent, but the Canucks' production during the regular season definitely cannot go overlooked, and this was a stunner. I don't know if necessarily it's going to be enough to be able to, fully carry them over the massive, I don't know if I'm ready to call it a massive talent discrepancy, but the Oilers are the better team, at least in my eyes, and coming out last night and having the performance that they did to steal that game feels pretty substantial in my eyes. Now, they're defending home ice right now. I believe that is the biggest thing for them in order to sort of keep this series in control, because obviously Oilers are not really to be played around with, so going to be interesting there. And then I guess sort of final thoughts here before we move on. I didn't get to catch the full Stars and Avalanche game, but I got to watch the third period on, and I thought that was such an impressive win for the Avalanche to come back down 3-0, and it seemed like, at that point they could have been in for it, but the veteran experience and the playoff experience of those Av players really did come into play there. And then we saw it in overtime after, definitely struggling earlier on in that game. Alexander Georgiev ends up standing on his head in that overtime period. He was getting peppered with shots early on, and they were able to just hold them off long enough to the point where they ended up getting the fast break opportunity. The breakaway speed from Miles Wood ends up winning that game for them. So I do think that the Avalanche are definitely not to be overlooked in this sort of playoff picture as well. Like I mentioned, it's not necessarily any kind of a hot take. They are tied with the Rangers for the best odds to win the Stanley Cup playoffs. But let us know what you think about the NHL playoffs in the comments section. I know we don't do a ton of hockey on this show, but as the playoffs continue to heat up, I'm going to try and throw some more action into the conversation here. But for now, we are going to be taking our second break of the show, and when we come back on the other side, I want to dive into the NBA awards that have been handed out during the past few days. So thank you again to Jeremy, Sam, Garrison for joining the show. You can catch all of them. We got Sam coming on right after my show, Jeremy following him, and then Garrison later tonight. So definitely check out their channels as well. They do incredible work, and like I mentioned, we will continue to be doing work with them. But on that note, taking our second break here, and when we come back on the other side, we will dive back into some NBA awards. So stick with us. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube. Absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We are now doing the second half of the show solo, and I want to start off here by talking about some of the NBA awards that were handed out over the past few days. We had Victor Wembanyama being named Rookie of the Year, Rudy Gobert as Defensive Player of the Year, and Nikola Jokic as MVP. Really, none of these were all too shocking, but did want to just sort of do a little bit of a recap here and talk about the overall bigger picture with some of this stuff. So Wembanyama wins Rookie of the Year. Again, it seemed like this was a competition up through probably January, maybe even before that, where Wemby did look like a lot more raw version of himself than what we saw, fully formed by the end of the year. And for Chet, I mean, the odds were always going to be stacked against him from both the perspective of the fact that he was going up against this generational player, and there was so much buzz around Wembanyama coming into the year. Ultimately, I don't think that it was sort of a media buzz voting in order for him to get this. It was fully earned. He was absolutely incredible throughout the second half of the year especially, and his counting stats would back that up. Averaged 21 points per game along with 10 rebounds, while also leading the NBA in assists, or in blocks, I should say. He added additionally 4 assists with that, but Wembanyama, I mean, we already know, we've heard about it a million times, the way that he is going to be a big-time riser, potential face of the league candidate as the years move on here. I do think that the Spurs have a real obligation to him this offseason to be able to put a legitimate point guard with him. The whole Jeremy Sohan experiment, and listen, I'm not as low on people. I'm not as low as on him as a lot of people are. I was also never necessarily a believer in him coming into the NBA, but they totally mismanaged him this past year. I understand that he has some qualities that can make him a little bit more of a point forward, archetype, but putting him as the full-on point guard in just, I believe, his second year, unless it was his third, he was on that championship Baylor team, so I believe he was drafted in 2022, but I thought that was just a really poor job. Again, I'm not going to dive into it too much, but there is a little bit of an interesting Greg Popovich conversation in terms of, we just saw Bill Belichick go through, the ups and downs of this post-Tom Brady era, and everybody believes in him as the coach, but can he, the general manager and the person putting these teams together actually come through and be a, somebody who can lead this next generation. I believe that Popovich has done loads for Wembanyama in his rookie year, so by no means am I trying to tear him down, but I think from a personnel perspective, and I don't know if he has the exact position title of general manager. I'll double check that right now, but we know that he is definitely involved in the decisions now. So Brian Wright is the general manager, but I think that ultimately for Popovich, it is going to be interesting to see whether or not he is able to put together a good enough roster that can maximize Wembanyama's talents. I'm not of the mindset at all of Wemby's going to ask his way out. I know that that was a narrative that, frankly, ESPN was pushing a little bit during the middle of the season. Love to see the competitiveness from Wemby, but I think that he can have his time to develop and sort of work his way into a winning system. But I would definitely prefer to see it sooner rather than later, so hopefully they figure themselves out. Rudy Gobert won Defensive Player of the Year. Again, not really much of a surprise. I know that there was a lot of pushing for Wembanyama to win the award as well, and I was very torn on it. Ultimately, when I did my show, I leaned in the direction of Wembanyama, but at the same time, I don't think it is egregious by any means that Gobert wins this. Wemby had the counting stats that sort of pushed it forward, but Gobert was ultimately, if you're looking at a full season's worth of experience, Gobert was better throughout. Wemby, and he was dealing with injuries that were sort of limiting how much he could even be on the court. Took a while for him to make his impact on the Spurs team, and the Spurs were very bad defensively outside of him, which is ultimately why I leaned in the direction of Wembanyama. The difference of how much better the defense was with him on the court was just, so mind-boggling to me that when I was looking at the numbers, I myself couldn't, make an argument for Gobert, but I do fully understand it as well. I know that a lot of basketball fans are upset with it, but Gobert, he ends up winning his 4th Defensive Player of the Year award in his career, one of 3 players to ever do so, putting himself really in conversation for, I think that even with 3, he was already sort of in that, you can call it at least a little bit comparable to the Dwight Howard career arc, at least some of the accomplishments. Now, Howard, I believe, had more all-star appearances, and he ended up leading the Magic to a finals run. But, I mean, for Gobert, if you want to talk his legacy big picture here, he is on this Timberwolves team that is absolutely rolling coming into the matchup that they're going to be taking place. I believe they play tomorrow against the Denver Nuggets with a chance to take a 3-0 lead at home. So it seems like the Timberwolves are fully geared up to potentially make this finals run. And if he adds a ring to this, I don't think that there is any question. And I know that there's a lot of box score watchers out there who just sort of casually follow the game, but Gobert's impact does absolutely extend beyond that, and I'm glad that he's gotten this little bit of a redemption season after last year was really ugly. And he was not the same level of defender last year is the reality, but I think that now he has made some internal adjustments of being able to settle into this new role with Minnesota, and it has absolutely paid off for them. I know the price they paid was very expensive at the time, but ultimately it's looking like they, can definitely make something of this. And again, if you want to 10 years from now sort of have this argument of did they pay too much, the answer is probably going to be yes, but at the same time, if they come away with a championship, it is no complaints, especially for that type of a fan base who hasn't necessarily seen all too much postseason success. The love that city has for, feels like more like Anthony Edwards. Obviously, it's his team. It might even be his league in the coming years, but I definitely think that it's fun to see these sort of mid-market teams and the way that they've been able to show out in terms of postseason appearances the past couple of years. I know I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but Minnesota, Oklahoma City, and that crowd situation is one of the best in professional sports from what I've seen recently. Maybe I'm getting caught up in that recency bias, but the Lou Dort chants, the entire stadium barking anytime Jalen Williams does something, it just makes me laugh as I watch these games, and it is definitely, an infectious feeling there in Oklahoma City. And then I also want to give credit to, obviously, Sacramento, Beam Team Stand Up, for the job that they did last year in helping to elevate their team. I'll never forget the run that they made in, I forget exactly what game it is, so this is going to be a point that sort of falls by the wayside here, but it was in one of the comebacks that they potentially made. I just remember seeing the crowd so into the game. They were down by 20 points early in the fourth quarter. I believe it was one of the Milwaukee Bucks games. Again, apologize, I don't have it off the top of my head here, but the Keegan Murray chants raining, and they ended up putting together this run. I just feel like Sacramento, they have another great fan base there, and Indiana is the last one that I wanted to shout out. It's fun to see these sort of mid-markets, and obviously the Knicks crowd has been crazy, but that's New York. That was a little bit expected. But final award here that I wanted to touch on was Nikola Jokic winning the MVP. I thought that this was the pretty clear-cut choice, and obviously the fact that he's getting awarded this as the Nuggets are down 0-2 is just another example of the NBA awards. They just need to figure out how to work out this rollout better. Last day of the regular season was April 14th. It was 5+ days until the playoffs officially started. April 20th was the first actual playoff games. We had some play-in games during the week there, but even Thursday was off. Just make it work at some point during that stretch. So the MVP award isn't coming with these artificial asterisks right now because Shea is still in the playoffs and, leading his team to a very solid run, and Jokic just sort of gets looked down upon because of the fact that he is down 0-2 right now. It's just a ridiculous gripe that I have with the NBA. But voting results were sort of straightforward here. It was Jokic getting 79 first-place votes, SGA with 15, Luka with 4, and Giannis got 1 in there as well. So I know that a lot of people were sort of pushing the agendas of SGA and Luka, and look, they had incredible seasons. Both of them are going to be first-team All-NBA, so it's not like it's any sort of conversation about the fact that they weren't deserving of being in the conversation. But best player in the NBA this year was easily Jokic, and he helped lead his team to just as many wins, if I'm not mistaken, as the Oklahoma City Thunder did. So ultimately you look at that 1 seed, and I think that people sort of overreact to that. They both won 57 games. And yes, Shea gets home court advantage if they were to face off in the in the playoffs here, but I just don't put as much stock into that overall seeding number as other people maybe do. But Jokic joins a list of players with at least 3 MVPs. It's now him, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Michael Jordan, Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, LeBron James, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, and Moses Malone. So just quite the impressive company there to be at this point, and doing so in my opinion, the most loaded in terms of talent era in NBA history. And I think that a lot of people, again, are going to try and diminish the Jokic situation because of the position they are currently in, but I am not going to be one of those people. But I do want to sort of talk some bigger picture ramifications of how the NBA playoffs could play out here through the final couple rounds. So we're going to be taking our final break of the show, and when we come back on the other side, I want to talk about that. So stick with us, and we will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, headed into our final segment of the day, and I wanted to have some conversations about the greater NBA playoffs picture. Just on the other side of the break, I was talking about Jokic winning the MVP award, third time in his career, and I wanted to sort of continue on that conversation, considering the fact, again, totally unfair in my eyes, that the NBA waits until the second round of the playoffs to make these types of award announcements, but does have an interesting conversation about the fact that Jokic is currently down the way that he is, and all of a sudden it feels like there has been this massive turn in the way that people are viewing this Nuggets run here, where last year they did somewhat benefit from playing some underachieving teams on the way into the postseason. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that this is totally, it is unfair inherently, that the Nuggets are being sort of thrown in this category of a lot of these other teams. It feels like NBA fans are just so quick to sort of turn the page on a team if it doesn't seem legitimate in their eyes. I feel like I haven't seen a title that was more disrespected than that 2021 Bucks finals, where I had so much fun watching the Giannis domination through that playoff run, and then all of a sudden a couple years later it is just looked down upon, and oh, well, if Kevin Durant's foot wasn't on the line, if we saw the if we saw the full version of Brooklyn with Kyrie and James Harden both playing all of those games, they never would have won. It's interesting how people always find ways to put asterisks on these championships, and it seems like the Nuggets are now a little bit at a point here where you look at their postseason run last year and they didn't play a single team that won 50 games in the playoffs. The first round they faced a 42-win Timberwolves team that was also without Jaden McDaniels for whatever it's worth, then a 45-win Suns team that was dealing with this Kevin Durant injury, or it was more so that the team just had no cohesion up to that point, and then ended up getting a 7th-seeded Lakers team that won 43 games in the regular season in the Western Conference Finals. And again, I want to preface the fact that I am not making any types of claims, I'm just laying out facts here. And then, of course, playing a 44-win 8th-seeded Heat team in the finals. And they looked absolutely dominant during this run. But the Timberwolves, in their current state, are far better than any other team they have faced up to this point. Now, I don't think that the fact you play who you play, and it is just one of those things where I don't like to play this revisionist history by any means. I was on the Nuggets all year this year as well. I thought, and I still weirdly kind of do feel like they are, I don't know, it's hard to say that they're fully better than the Timberwolves right now or the Celtics, but they handled their business against the Celtics during the regular season, who were, historically good from a net rating perspective in the regular season. And, they were fine against the Wolves as well, and now obviously trailing 2-0, seems like their season is on the brink here, especially if they don't steal both of these games in Minnesota. But I just feel like it's going to be very interesting where Jokic's legacy all of a sudden, and again, recency bias is just hitting like an MFer right now, but the fact that we see all of these people coming to now criticize Jokic of winning these 3 MVPs, but having, this one fake run in people's eyes, it's a shame how this is how NBA discourse works. I swear that people don't actually enjoy watching these games. They just like tearing down players that don't play for their team. It drives me nuts personally, but there is definitely a legacy thing in the balance here for the Nuggets. And now we want to sort of switch gears with that same idea to the Boston Celtics moving forward. There are plenty of people now who are already... Boston radio is one of the most unbearable things. As somebody who lives in the Massachusetts area, I hear a lot of it. And yesterday, one of the big networks was talking about how it just feels hollow the way that this Celtics run has played out up to this point, that they're, beating down on these weaker opponents, and there are other people in the fans of teams in the Eastern Conference saying, oh, well, it's so unfair. The Celtics have this cakewalk. Well, they went out and they got the 1 seed for a reason. It wasn't just to have fun in the regular season. It was to put themselves in the best possible situation in the playoffs, which is the same situation with the Nuggets last year. You play who you play, and obviously it's more fun when you have these epic matchups along the way, but ultimately these teams they're not making these runs in order for PR purposes. They're trying to win a championship. So that's already a storyline that is sort of surrounding the Celtics, and added on with the fact that the Knicks are dealing with this OG Anunoby injury. We don't know the full details on him just yet. Like we mentioned earlier in the show, he was dealing with a left hamstring injury during the third quarter that kept him out for the rest of the game. Jalen Brunson's foot, for whatever it's worth. I mean, I think that ideally, knock on wood, he's going to be okay. He was able to play the second half and was great down the stretch in that game as well. But an already thin Knicks team that's dealing with a lot of injuries, feels like the Celtics have a chance, at least, to sort of go through the Eastern Conference without much of a sweat, which does lead to this bigger conversation of, especially with the fact that the Nuggets were the team that they were definitely most afraid of coming into the playoffs. They might be eliminated this round. Does feel like the pressure is really heating up for the Celtics to not go out and win this year. And, even after dominating the Cavaliers in their matchup from the other night, it was, oh, well, the Celtics didn't look good enough in this 25-point win. Jason Tatum didn't score enough points, even though I do think he had a very nice, well-rounded performance outside of some of the chucking up threes and the lack of efficiency scoring-wise. He still had a good game in my eyes, and, the pressure cooker is just absolutely on for the Celtics right now, and it feels like the front office is going to move forward with this group, but it does become a little bit of an interesting conversation. If this isn't the year for them, when is it going to come? And I ultimately, again, think that the idea here should be to continue on with the group. They are in that second luxury tax threshold where all of these other moves are restricted for them. So it is pretty much just leaning on the players that they have. I think, the top 8 is a very solid core for them, fully healthy. Their starting lineup, and then Al Horford, Sam Hauser, and Peyton Pritchard off of the bench. I think that should all work. And, when you look at the Nuggets and their current situation, I think I mentioned this quote the other day, but the decision makers for the Nuggets, when they were talking about their plan in this past offseason, it was about, our goal isn't to repeat as champions, it's to become a dynasty. So we saw them sort of invest more so into their youth with getting Peyton Watson more looks, Christian Brown as well. They traded down a little bit to add a couple other pieces to their roster, Julian Strawther and Hunter Tyson, who haven't really been getting playing time for them, but it's the idea of sort of developing them and having them sort of fit into the puzzle. For the Celtics here, they have that whole starting lineup other than Derek White, where it sounds like Brad Stevens, their general manager, is committed to making sure that he comes back long-term for them. Seems like they are trying to, build into what they have now and this continued development. Peyton Pritchard was a late first-round pick. Sam Hauser, I believe, was a second-round pick. I am fully admitting here that I have a little bit of the Boston bias. Very, very much looking forward to see if Jordan Walsh can turn into anything, because I loved him at Arkansas, and I think that he has actually a very solid ceiling that was overshadowed because of the fact that he was sharing so much time with more of score-first guards that ended up being first-round picks last year, Nick Smith Jr. and Anthony Black. But I do like the track the Celtics are on. That's not something that is any sort of a hot take whatsoever. But I just feel like it is sort of... I wanted to take a look at some of these bigger picture deals for the Celtics and the Nuggets. And then, for the Timberwolves, it seems like they have their core pretty much locked up as well. Now, things are going to get interesting for them. I talked about this the other day, this idea of how are they going to sort of situate this Gobert situation and balancing it with Naz Reid. Right now, they are paying these three centers a good amount of money, and we're going to see both Naz Reid and Rudy Gobert end up having player options in the same offseason in 2025-26. I would imagine both of them are going to decline that. The Timberwolves gave up all of these assets for Rudy Gobert, and listen, if they win the championship this year or next year, it makes that decision to walk away from him a whole lot easier. But we know with some of these general managers, and by the way, had no idea, I believe his name is Tim Connolly, is the general manager for the Minnesota Timberwolves right now. He's at least on the front office staff there, that he was also the one to build up this Nuggets team, and now he's built up this team that is perfectly tailored to take out the Nuggets. I mean, just a ridiculous subplot there that I had no idea about until it came across my timeline on social media the other day. But just sort of as a funny side note, the Timberwolves, I don't know. Ultimately, it's Anthony Edwards. It seems like he is definitely in prime position to be one of the faces of the league, if not the guy for the NBA. And he has a chance to establish that this year with the NBA Finals. And I don't have all the details, so I definitely don't want to, put any type of damning on the Timberwolves, especially as they're having this awesome run. But in terms of assets moving forward, they are maybe a little bit more limited in my eyes than the Nuggets and the Celtics. But these are the three teams right now, and I think that it's going to be really fun to see how all of this shakes out for them. I think that, again, probably looking now at a Timberwolves-Celtics finals, but even if you throw the Thunder into that conversation, I don't think they would have the size to match up against the Timberwolves in the Western Conference Finals, if we're sort of looking ahead there. But, if the Nuggets get eliminated, the last thing I'll say is, should be really fun. We're going to see a brand new team win a finals. Pacers, Knicks, take your pick. Celtics, sorry Cavs fans, I don't really include you in this conversation, but one of those three. And then Timberwolves, could see Luka and the Mavericks pull off some type of comeback, and the Oklahoma City Thunder with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. This whole idea of next face of the NBA, and the way that we've seen all of these, past generation greats eliminated early in the postseason this year, could give us a little bit more of a clear picture as to what the future of the NBA looks like. And just as an NBA nerd, I'm definitely looking forward to it. But that is all we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to our guests today, Jeremy Lapidus, Sports by GSMC. We had Sam Menzie as well. He is going to be coming on very shortly, live at 3:30, so definitely check him out. Baseball podcast, and Garrison as well is the hockey/golf podcast. I believe he's doing golf today, so check him out later tonight as well. Going to be doing a lot more collaborative projects as we move on here. Super fun, super exciting stuff to see. But thank you very much for tuning in. We are live every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern, so check us out tomorrow. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. and check us out on social media as well for our exclusive short content. But that is all we have for today. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.